Brooklyn Myers had always felt like an outsider, even before she entered the doors of Coastal Dynamics. The sterile white cubicles and humming fluorescent lights offered her no comfort, only camouflage. She blended in, her quiet presence easy to overlook among the chatter of printers and the monotony of office routines. But it wasn't indifference that shaped her silence. It was a tightly wound restraint. From the outside, her life seemed uneventful. She clocked in at 8:00 a.m. by the end. Always early, always in the same gray cardigan and black flats, her brown hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and her eyes never quite met anyone else's. She was a fixture, like the water cooler or the locked supply cabinet, present, functional, forgettable. But for Brooklyn, every day inside that office was an exercise in control. Her work was repetitive but precise, and she found a strange sense of order in inputting shipment logs and billing records. Numbers never mocked her. Dates never abandoned her. Unlike people, they made sense. She excelled in her tasks, gaining Palmer's approval quietly, though she never asked for it. She didn't need recognition. She needed structure. Every keystroke, every cell filled in the Excel sheets felt like a barrier between her and the chaos that threatened to rise inside her. At her desk, she was safe, from others and from herself. Yet that fragile sense of safety was tested daily. Every snicker from across the office, every time she caught a sideways glance, every accidental brush of someone's shoulder in the hallway brought on a storm of mental static. She couldn't stand being touched. She flinched when someone said her name too loudly. There was a thin veil between her and collapse, and it thinned more with each passing week. Her coworkers chalked it up to social awkwardness. A few thought she might be on the spectrum. No one guessed that she kept a broken kitchen knife in the drawer beside her bed. No one saw the thick binder beneath her mattress filled with pictures of strangers, cut from catalogs, magazines, old employee newsletters, each face circled with red ink, each with notes like "liar" or "false smile" scrawled beneath. No one knew she still slept with the light on. Because of what happened in her father's garage when she was 12, in her apartment everything was too quiet. The walls were bare, the furniture minimal, and nothing about the space suggested comfort. She didn't own a television or a mirror. Her phone was 10 years old and always on silent. She didn't speak to her parents, not since the night she walked barefoot for 2 hours to a diner after her mother slammed the door in her face. They'd written her off as troubled, claimed she was manipulative, unstable, attention-seeking. But Brooklyn wasn't looking for attention. She wanted to disappear. Or, failing that, she wanted to punish the people who made her wish she could. Her days were fueled by a private set of rituals. She counted her footsteps, always in multiples of 3. She avoided odd-numbered floors and buildings. She never drank anything that wasn't sealed. She scratched the same part of her wrist until it bled, then dabbed the wound with hydrogen peroxide and reapplied a bandage with unsettling care. Pain was clarity. Blood reminded her she was still here. Some nights, she'd lie in bed tracing the cracks in the ceiling with her eyes, naming all the people who had laughed at her, doubted her, touched her when she didn't want to be touched. The list grew longer each month. She didn't talk to her coworkers, but she watched them. She memorized their lunch schedules, their car models, their perfume brands. She knew that Haley in accounts left early on Thursdays for therapy. She knew that Mike from shipping smoked Marlboros in the north parking lot during his 2:30 break. She knew that Derek Palmer had a daughter in middle school and wore the same navy tie every Tuesday. These were not observations. They were entries in a growing ledger of human behavior, collected and categorized with obsessive intent. She told herself it was research, understanding patterns, identifying threats. She convinced herself she was preparing, not for revenge, but for self-preservation. The world was cruel, and she would no longer be its victim. The walls between thought and action began to erode slowly. A spilt coffee on her desk set off a week-long spiral of insomnia and nosebleeds. The janitor's casual remark about her zoning out resulted in her deleting all her files and starting them from scratch just to erase any trace of perceived error. When Palmer once jokingly asked if she had a boyfriend, she didn't respond, just stared at him until he backed away, mumbling. She hated jokes. Jokes hid malice. Jokes were how people said cruel things without consequence. Late one Friday evening, she stayed behind long after everyone left, claiming she had to finish reconciling a shipment report, but that wasn't true. She just wanted to walk the office, alone, in the quiet. She stood in each cubicle, imagining the lives of those who sat there, what they'd done, what they'd said, who they might hurt if no one stopped them. She found a thumb drive left in a desk drawer. She took it. She copied everything on it to her laptop at home. Employee evaluations, HR complaints, disciplinary records. Information was power. Power was safety. That same weekend, she drove 3 hours north to a hardware store that didn't ask questions and paid cash for materials she kept in a sealed box under her bed. Nails, rubber gloves, a gas mask. Her collection was growing. She still hadn't decided on a plan, but the idea of having options made her feel more in control. Some nights, she simply opened the box, arranged the contents neatly on the floor, and stared at them until dawn. The tools didn't mock her, they didn't lie. By the time Brooklyn turned 20, the transformation was nearly complete. She still smiled politely when spoken to, still submitted perfect spreadsheets on time, still wore the same cardigan and shoes, but her thoughts had grown darker, more organized. There was a terrible order to them now. She'd stopped feeling afraid. What replaced fear wasn't peace, it was precision, and with that came a dangerous certainty that one day she would no longer be invisible. In the sterile routine of coastal dynamics, the descent of Brooklyn Myers into paranoia was invisible to the untrained eye. To most, she remained the same quiet girl tucked into her cubicle, the one who always replied with a slight nod and never stayed long in the break room. But beneath that composed surface, the pressure had been building for months. What began as discomfort grew into distrust, then into something far more dangerous. It wasn't a sudden rupture, but a gradual corrosion of her perception, a subtle tilt in the world around her until everything she saw was shaded in suspicion. The harmless notes, left perhaps by well-meaning colleagues trying to lift her mood, became the seeds of her obsession. Smile more felt like an accusation, an insult meant to expose her perceived failure at being normal. You're too serious wasn't advice, it was a warning, a signal from the enemy camp. Every sticky note became a message coded in ridicule. No one thought to question her silence. Her coworkers were preoccupied with their own deadlines, their own lives. To them, Brooklyn's behavior hadn't changed, but inside, her thoughts had turned inward, circling a central idea that tightened like a noose with each passing week. She was being watched. It was no longer a passing thought or anxious suspicion, it had become fact in her mind. She began to document everything, the times people looked her way, the dates when coffee mugs were left on her desk without explanation, the frequency with which Laura Jameson passed by humming the same tune. These were not coincidences, they were patterns. She carried a small black notebook with her at all times, carefully concealed beneath folders and documents. In it, she wrote compulsively, assigning numbers, roles, and names to the people around her. Her manager became Commander 3, while the janitor who once whistled too long near her cubicle became Runner Delta. Laura, ever-smiling Laura, was labeled LM Prime, lead manipulator. She no longer saw them as individuals. They were operatives, part of a coordinated network whose sole mission was to study, provoke, and report on her. She believed her apartment was bugged. She unplugged her microwave and wrapped her rower in aluminum foil. Her bathroom mirror was covered with masking tape, and her windows were perpetually shut. The blinds sealed tight even during the sweltering Florida summer. At night, she wore headphones and played white noise to drown out the imagined transmissions. Sleep became fractured, haunted by dreams of coded signals and shadowed figures standing at her door. The journal entries grew darker, more erratic. She began to use red ink, marking certain phrases in capital letters and enclosing them in drawn boxes. Words like cleansing, sacrifice, and judgment appeared frequently, alongside distorted sketches of eyes, fire, and thorns. On weekends, she would travel to different churches, staying no more than 10 minutes in each. She didn't pray. She listened to the tone of the sermons, to the rhythm of the congregation's words, to any sign that might confirm what she already believed, that the world was sick, and she had been chosen to see the infection. She stopped speaking altogether outside of work. Her phone calls went unanswered, her messages unread. She cut out old yearbook photos and glued them to her apartment wall in elaborate constellations, connecting faces with thread and pushpins, convinced that each one held a key to decoding her mission. No one at the office suspected the magnitude of what was taking place. She still turned in her reports on time. She still responded to emails with brief, polite acknowledgments. But behind the screen, she was analyzing every sentence for double meanings. The phrase, "Can you take a look at this for me?" became, "We know you're watching." A typo in a colleague's message was interpreted as intentional. A ciphered hint dropped to test her reactions. Her mind began to treat reality like a puzzle, twisting facts and memories into narratives that supported her suspicions. The more unstable her thinking became, the more convinced she was that she alone had clarity. Her obsession with Laura Jameson took on a ritualistic intensity. Brooklyn followed her to and from her car, noting the times Laura arrived and departed, where she parked, what she wore, what kind of gum she chewed. She wrote lengthy entries describing Laura's methods of charm, believing the receptionist's friendliness was a disguise, camouflage for psychological warfare. In Brooklyn's eyes, Laura's laugh was too loud, her interest too practiced, her warmth too insistent. These weren't human traits, they were tactics. One entry read, "LM Prime employs smile device to destabilize target. Resist contact. Countermeasures needed." The pages of her notebook began to include countdowns, numbers that decreased by 1 each day, paired with phrases like reckoning, strike point, and final breach. When the numbers reached the single digits, her behavior became more erratic. She no longer made eye contact at all. She started wearing gloves indoors, convinced that fingerprints were being tracked. Her meals became identical. Plain, boiled rice and bottled water, eaten in precise quantities, timed to the second. Her rituals became sacraments, and her journal the holy text. The line between paranoia and purpose dissolved. She began to see herself as a martyr of truth, a vessel for vengeance against a world that had poisoned her with isolation and surveillance. Every slight, every humiliation she had experienced since childhood was folded into the narrative. The boys who laughed at her crooked teeth, the teacher who ignored her cries during recess, the therapist who said she was misinterpreting reality. They were all agents, part of the same system that now surrounded her at Coastal Dynamics. On the morning of April 28, 2025, she arrived early to work. She wore a long black coat despite the heat and carried her journal clutched tightly under one arm. She didn't greet the security guard. She walked straight to her cubicle, opened her notebook, and wrote a single line across the center of the page. 42 sins, 1 redemption. Then she closed the cover, locked it in her drawer, and stared at the clock for almost an hour, unmoving. No one noticed. No one asked her if she was okay. She was invisible, just as she had always been. And now, in her mind, she had become something else entirely, an instrument of balance. Not lost, not broken, not mad. Just chosen. The morning of May 5, 2025 passed unnoticed by the city that was just beginning to stir. Traffic lights blinked in quiet succession, emails started pouring into inboxes, and the air carried the usual blend of humidity and exhaust so familiar to Fort Lauderdale. At Coastal Dynamics, the day was meant to be ordinary. Spreadsheet updates, team calls, the scent of burnt coffee lingering near the break room. But beneath the quiet monotony of that Monday morning, something irreversible was about to unfold. Brooklyn Myers, 20 years old, stepped through the front doors of the office building at 8:03 a.m. Her pace was measured, her eyes unreadable. She wore a gray hoodie zipped up to her neck, the hood casting a faint shadow over her face. In her backpack was a carefully curated arsenal. 2 handguns, each with spare magazines, a modified semi-automatic rifle with a shortened barrel for maneuverability, and 4 homemade pipe bombs wrapped in layers of electrical tape and packed with shrapnel. She had spent weeks assembling them using instructions printed from old message boards and obscure online forums. Each weapon had been chosen not only for efficiency, but for symbolism. She viewed the guns as judgment and the bombs as purification. No one greeted her as she walked in. She passed by the security desk, where a new hire was too distracted by his phone to notice the tension in her gait. Her badge beeped green. She entered. Surveillance footage later reviewed in court captured the unsettling serenity in her movements. No hesitation, no deviation, just precision. She walked straight to the break room, a space of laughter and idle talk now destined for silence. Once inside, she locked both doors from within. The locking mechanism had been studied in advance. A thin metal rod wedged between the handles and a loop of reinforced cable secured both exits. The setup took her 23 seconds. At 8:16 a.m., the first shot rang out. Paul Alvarez had just stepped inside to refill his coffee when a single bullet struck him in the chest. He died instantly, the mug still in his hand. Janet Liu was next, caught mid-sentence, a bright smile still frozen on her face. She collapsed in front of the refrigerator door, her phone buzzing in her pocket with a missed call from her daughter's school. The sound of gunfire reverberated through the floor, and what followed was chaos in its rawest form. Screams tore through the office corridors. Chairs overturned, alarms blared, and people sprinted in every direction, most with no idea where the danger was coming from. Brooklyn left the break room calmly. She walked into the main office floor, firing in short, controlled bursts. Each shot was deliberate. There was no erratic flailing, no wild swinging of the weapon. She moved with the slow, terrifying certainty of someone who believed they were fulfilling a divine task. The rifle never left her grip, and her face remained blank, even as bodies crumpled before her. Those who tried to flee were met with bullets in the hallway. Others barricaded themselves in conference rooms or under desks, their frantic prayers and stifled sobs drowned by the echo of sustained gunfire. Smoke began to fill the eastern stairwell at 8:21 a.m. One of her homemade bombs had detonated beneath the metal steps, its force cracking the tile walls and setting off the building's fire suppression system. Water began pouring from the ceiling, but it only added to the confusion. The fire alarm strobing in red, the choking haze, the scent of burning plastic, none of it slowed her. She advanced methodically, cutting off escape routes with gunfire and flames. One of the pipe bombs had been placed near the emergency exit on the second floor. It exploded at 8:23 a.m., killing 5 people who had gathered there in a desperate bid for freedom. Brooklyn didn't speak a word. She didn't scream or curse or make declarations. She was silent, mechanical, an executioner without emotion. One witness, later interviewed from his hospital bed, recalled seeing her walk past a row of cubicles, glancing left and right, her eyes steady and vacant, as if searching for specific names on a list. There was no randomness in her path. She bypassed the marketing wing entirely. Instead, she returned to the operations floor, where she reloaded her rifle with chilling calm and opened fire once more, targeting those who had not moved fast enough or had simply frozen in fear. By 8:26 a.m., 11 minutes had passed since the first bullet. The call to 908-11 had gone out within seconds of the shooting's start, and SWAT had been dispatched immediately, but navigating the dense urban traffic delayed their arrival. When the armored vehicle pulled into the lot, plumes of black smoke were already curling from the side of the building. Firefighters attempted to breach from the west entrance, but were repelled by another device, this one not detonated but rigged to look real, buying Brooklyn more time. Police communications described the situation as active threat with unknown explosives, potential mass casualty. They moved swiftly but cautiously, unsure what traps still lay inside. At 8:27 a.m., the tactical team entered through a shattered side window. They swept the corridors, weapons raised, calling out commands no one was left to hear. What they encountered was horror on a scale few had seen. The floor was slick with water and blood. Ceiling panels had collapsed. The air was heavy with cordite and ash. They moved room by room, clearing hallways where only the dead remained. Finally, in the administrative wing, they found her. Brooklyn sat at her desk, her usual desk, amid the wreckage. Her hoodie was torn and singed, her face streaked with soot and splattered with blood. The rifle lay neatly across her lap, muzzle pointed toward the floor, her hands resting on either side of the weapon. Her eyes were open. She didn't flinch when the officers burst in. She didn't speak. She didn't move. One officer described her as peaceful, like she had just finished a long task and was finally at rest. The carnage around her told another story. 42 people were confirmed dead. Another 15 were hospitalized, several in critical condition. The death toll made it the deadliest workplace shooting in Florida's history. The news broke within the hour. Helicopters swarmed overhead. Families gathered outside yellow tape barriers. The nation reeled. Inside the building, as emergency crews moved through the smoke and devastation, Brooklyn was handcuffed without resistance. She said nothing. She did not cry. A medic checked her for injuries and found only minor abrasions. The journal was not with her. It would be recovered days later during a secondary sweep of the premises, hidden inside a locked filing cabinet she had previously claimed was used for outdated training manuals. She would later be declared competent to stand trial. But on that morning, May 5, 2025, Brooklyn Myers said nothing to anyone. Not the officers, not the paramedics, not the survivors. The silence she had always worn like armor had become absolute. The first headlines appeared just after noon. At first, they were fragmented. Active shooter in Fort Lauderdale, dozens feared dead at Office Park. But by mid-afternoon, every news channel across the country was broadcasting live coverage of the Florida office massacre. The footage looping endlessly, helicopters hovering above the scorched roof of Coastal Dynamics, body bags being wheeled past stunned first responders, and sobbing family members huddled behind police barricades. The death toll climbed with each update. 42 lives lost in just 11 minutes. The country, still raw from a decade of similar tragedies, fell into a familiar but no less devastating rhythm of shock, questions, and anger. This wasn't just another shooting. It was now the deadliest workplace mass murder in U.S. history. Within hours, the name Brooklyn Myers was on every screen. Her school photo was pulled from old databases, shared alongside a grainy snapshot from office security footage. Her gray hoodie zipped up to her throat, her eyes flat, empty. The juxtaposition between the pale teenager in a yearbook and the blood-stained killer seated calmly at her desk sparked confusion, rage, and a storm of speculation. How could someone so young carry out something so calculated? What could possibly lead a 19-year-old to plan and execute an attack of such magnitude and precision? The questions poured in. How had she legally acquired the weapons? Which loopholes had allowed her to stockpile ammunition and build explosives undetected? Background checks showed she had no criminal record, no psychiatric holds, and nothing that would have raised flags during a standard firearm purchase in Florida. She had bought the handguns through licensed dealers, passing each check without issue. The rifle had been modified after purchase in a manner that experts later confirmed could be done with widely available parts and basic online instructions. As for the bombs, none of the chemicals used to build them were illegal to possess individually. The ingredients were purchased over the course of months at different stores through cash transactions. Attention quickly turned to her parents. Tom and Melissa Myers, once anonymous residents of a quiet suburb in Broward County, were suddenly at the center of a media firestorm. Their house was surrounded by cameras and reporters demanding comment. After nearly 24 hours of silence, they issued a brief statement from their porch, Tom's hands trembling as he read it. "We are heartbroken. We cannot understand how this happened. Brooklyn was our daughter. We didn't raise a monster." Melissa sobbed beside him, clutching a photo of Brooklyn at age 10, grinning in a Halloween costume. Their anguish did little to quiet the public fury. Commentators accused them of negligence, of ignoring warning signs, of fostering an environment that could breed such hatred. Some pointed to court records confirming Brooklyn had been estranged from them for nearly 2 years. Others noted that she had attended counseling briefly as a minor, though no one seemed to know what the outcome had been. The Myers home was eventually placed under police protection after several threats were made against the family. At the Coastal Dynamics building, a makeshift memorial appeared within hours. Flowers, candles, photographs, and notes lined the sidewalk. Posters with the names of the victims, Paul Alvarez, Janet Liu, Reggie Sandoval, and so many others, fluttered in the breeze. Some visitors stood in silence. Others wept openly, clinging to one another. Across Florida, memorial services were held in schools, churches, and public squares. The city of Fort Lauderdale observed a moment of silence that Friday. The state's flags were lowered to half-staff for a week. Photos of the victims filled social media feeds, smiling faces frozen in time. Parents, spouses, recent college graduates, immigrants, veterans. Each story added new weight to the tragedy. There was the woman who had just returned from maternity leave, the man who was planning to retire at the end of the month. The intern who had been working his very first day, Governor Lindsey Trammell, held a press conference the evening after the massacre, her voice strained, her posture rigid. "This is a tragedy that demands action," she declared, calling for a special legislative session to examine Florida's gun laws and the state's mental health infrastructure. The public, still reeling, responded with mixed emotions: grief tangled with rage, mourning laced with blame. Protests erupted in front of government buildings. Activists demanded stricter background checks, mandatory waiting periods, and red flag laws that could allow family members or employers to report concerns. Others argued for deeper investments in mental health care, citing the failure to detect Brooklyn's delusions as proof of a broken system. Survivors who had been off-site on the day of the shooting began to speak out. Derek Palmer, Brooklyn's former manager, appeared on local news, visibly shaken. "I keep thinking, what if I had been there? What if I had said something, done something?" He described Brooklyn as quiet, distant, but never threatening. He admitted to once calling her a focused young woman with potential. Now he could barely say her name. Survivor's guilt ran thick through the testimonies. Co-workers who had taken sick days, who had been in meetings across town, who had left early for dentist appointments, all spoke of disbelief, of trying to reconcile the face they knew with the horror they'd heard about. In the days that followed, the story shifted again. Investigators released excerpts from Brooklyn's journals, fragments of apocalyptic rhetoric, countdowns, violent drawings, and obsessive entries about co-workers. A psychologist retained by law enforcement described her writings as indicative of untreated paranoid delusion with disorganized thought patterns and religious grandiosity. The word cleansing had appeared more than 20 times. Redemption had been scrawled over an old company newsletter. Despite the disturbing content, there had been no official record of psychiatric intervention since her early teens. The gaps in oversight became the subject of scathing editorials. Online, the response was no less visceral. Social media platforms flooded with tributes and fury. Hashtags like Justice for 42 and End the Silence trended for days. The victims' families created a coalition that called for legislative reform, while conspiracy theorists spun dangerous narratives about government cover-ups and false flags. Brooklyn's name was scrubbed from most mainstream reports by the end of the week in a growing movement to deny mass killers notoriety. She became simply the shooter or the suspect. But the damage was done. Her face was already etched into public consciousness, an unsettling symbol of something far larger than herself. In classrooms, churches, and town halls across the country, people tried to understand what had happened, not just the logistics of it, but the why. Why had no one noticed the signs? Why had no one intervened? How could a young woman carry so much rage, so much calculated destruction within a life that seemed so quiet, so unremarkable? The questions echoed louder than any answers, and in the stillness left behind, only grief remained. Grief and a growing conviction that this could not be allowed to happen again. When Brooklyn Myers was finally brought into the cold, windowless room for questioning, there was no trace of the panic or hysteria that typically followed such unthinkable violence. Her clothes, still streaked with grime and dried blood, clung to her small frame, but she sat with the stillness of someone entirely removed from the reality around her. Her eyes, hollow and unnervingly focused, drifted across the room, as if studying its design more than acknowledging the presence of the officers who flanked her. From the outset, it was clear that the woman sitting in that chair bore no remorse, no regret, no fear of what she had done or what would come next. Throughout the interrogation, she never raised her voice, never faltered. The statements she made were haunting in their conviction. She didn't claim innocence, but neither did she speak of guilt. When asked why she had opened fire on unarmed co-workers, she answered without hesitation, "I didn't kill people. I removed demons." To her, each victim had been a vessel for corruption, a symbol of the disease she believed had infiltrated her world. She spoke of them not as individuals, but as units of influence, suggesting that their destruction was not violence, but purification. She claimed the office wasn't a workplace at all, but a facade, a government simulation cloaked in corporate normalcy. According to her, every interaction she had endured there had been scripted, every smile rehearsed, every message coded. She was being tested, she said, and the only way to pass was to dismantle the system entirely. These were not passing fantasies or vague delusions. Her language was structured, her metaphors consistent. She referred to her coworkers by alphanumeric designations, repeating many of the same codes found in her journals. She explained in clinical detail that the test had begun months prior when she began receiving what she believed were instructions hidden in photocopier noises, the patterns of overhead lights, and the way emails were formatted. Her task, as she saw it, was to uncover the deception and act accordingly. By the time she walked into the break room with a loaded rifle, she believed she was executing the final step of a preordained protocol. It was this absolute certainty that disturbed the forensic psychologist assigned to evaluate her. After multiple sessions, extensive assessments, and the analysis of her cognitive patterns, the diagnosis was formalized. Brooklyn Myers suffered from a severe form of psychosis, marked by paranoid delusions, religious and persecutory ideation, and impaired reality testing. Her sense of self had detached completely from societal norms, replaced by an intricate internal narrative that justified mass murder as divine justice. And yet, despite the depth of her condition, the court found her legally competent to stand trial. She could understand the charges, could communicate with her legal team, could follow courtroom procedures. Her mind, though fractured, remained terrifyingly lucid within its own framework. The evidence against her was overwhelming, but what alarmed investigators most wasn't just what she had done, it was how meticulously she had prepared to do it. Her journals, retrieved from her apartment and workplace locker, spanned nearly a year of obsessive documentation. Thousands of pages detailed her interpretation of everyday events as encoded attacks. Sketches of her office layout were paired with lists of employees categorized by threat level. Her obsession with coworkers like Laura Jameson was laid bare in chilling annotations. Primary manipulator, weak points, eyes, trust gestures, voice pitch. She had written multiple entries describing possible ambush points, weapon concealment methods, and exit strategies. There was no moment of spontaneous rage. The massacre was a cold, deliberate operation. Digital forensics painted an equally unsettling portrait. On her laptop, a folder titled Reckoning contained floor plans of the Coastal Dynamics building. Some scanned from official blueprints, others clearly hand-drawn. There were weekly staff schedules, employee photos clipped from internal newsletters, and maps marked with red lines tracing emergency exits and common breakroom traffic patterns. Most chilling was a list of 49 names, current employees, managers, even janitorial staff. 42 of those names had X's drawn over them. The others, presumably absent that day, remained untouched. She had known who would be there. She had planned for the body count. Her browser history was a catalog of nightmare fuel. Bookmarks included archived interviews with the Columbine shooters' families, tactical breakdowns of the Virginia Tech massacre, and Reddit threads analyzing school shooting timelines. She had saved PDFs titled Tactical Efficiency in Close Quarters and Psychological Response Time in Crisis Events. In the months leading up to the attack, her search queries grew darker, more focused. How many bullets to end a crowd? Fastest way to seal office exits? Time from 911 call to SWAT entry. There were no emotional outbursts, no fanatical manifestos. It was all research, precise, clinical, and horrifying. When officers scoured her apartment, they found evidence of rehearsals, empty bullet casings arranged by type, homemade targets in the shape of human silhouettes, audio recordings of office background noise layered with distorted sound bites, as if she had tried to replicate the atmosphere of her workplace in order to train herself for the attack. The box of tools found beneath her bed included a second unused pipe bomb, additional ammunition, and a typed letter labeled Final Log Pat. Investigators believe she intended to die during the assault. The fact that she survived was likely due to timing and the failure of a second explosive device near the lobby, which misfired and was later diffused. There was no outward ideology attached to her motives, no political statement, no alignment with extremist groups. Her violence had been intensely personal, rooted in a warped belief that she had been chosen to cleanse her surroundings of hidden malevolence. events. She had built a system of meaning around isolation, rejection, and fear, using the language of warfare to make sense of emotions too complex to express. And in doing so, she transformed her perception of helplessness into a mission of annihilation. Court records later revealed that Brooklyn's defense attorney struggled to find a viable path forward. An insanity plea was discussed but deemed unlikely to succeed, given her organized behavior and the legal threshold for insanity in Florida. Public defenders reviewed the journals, the search history, and the interviews and came to the same conclusion. She was ill, yes, but she had also been conscious, purposeful, and devastatingly effective. In the end, Brooklyn Myers did not weep for what she had done. She did not beg for forgiveness or curse the system that had failed her. During her interrogation, she never once asked about the victims, their families, or what would happen next. The only question she reportedly posed to her legal team was whether or not the test administrators had taken note of her performance, and even that wasn't asked aloud. It was written on a piece of paper, folded in half, and handed over with a slight smile. A smile that left no doubt in anyone's mind. Brooklyn wasn't searching for justice. She believed she had already found it. The trial of Brooklyn Myers began under the cold gray skies of January 2026, a year after the massacre that had forever altered the identity of Fort Lauderdale. From the first day, it was clear that this would not be an ordinary courtroom proceeding. Lines formed outside the courthouse before sunrise, families of victims dressed in black, reporters jockeying for position, and strangers who simply wanted to look into the eyes of the girl who had extinguished 42 lives in 11 minutes. Every seat was filled. Spectators held photos of the dead in their laps. Some wore ribbons, and many clutched tissues as the proceedings began. The air inside was heavy with grief and anticipation. The silence before each session filled with unspoken questions that the justice system was expected to answer. The prosecution wasted no time in building their narrative. Their strategy was simple and brutal. Brooklyn Myers was not a victim of circumstance, but a remorseless killer who had planned each death with military precision. They displayed her journals on a projection screen for the court to see, pages stained with red ink, diagrams of the building, names crossed out. The folder labeled Reckoning was introduced as the centerpiece of her intent, containing employee schedules, floor plans, and twisted mission statements. Assistant District Attorney Carla Hughes stood before the jury with a voice edged in steel as she read from Brooklyn's search history: how to end a crowd, fastest gun reload, how to disable a fire alarm, each fact stacked like bricks around the prosecution's central argument that Brooklyn was sane enough to design and execute one of the most methodical mass killings in American history. The death penalty, they said, was not only justified but necessary to deliver a measure of closure for the victims' families. Across the aisle, the defense faced an uphill battle. Led by court-appointed attorney Malcolm Reed, the defense team didn't deny the killings. Their argument hinged instead on Brooklyn's mind, fractured, delusional, shaped by years of untreated psychosis. They called psychologists to the stand who described in clinical detail the symptoms she exhibited: disordered thinking, delusional persecution, religious hallucinations, her obsession with being watched, her belief that her co-workers were demons, her detachment from reality, all pointed, in Reed's words, to a young woman abandoned by every safeguard we're supposed to have in place. They reminded the court of her absence from any psychiatric treatment in her late teens, despite clear warning signs. They referenced her estranged parents, her isolation, her complete withdrawal from society long before the killings. The defense stopped short of pleading insanity, aware it would likely fail, but argued that life imprisonment with psychiatric care was a more just outcome than state-sanctioned execution. The tension inside the courtroom never wavered. Each day of testimony reopened wounds for the families. They watched surveillance clips, frame by frame. They listened to descriptions of gunshot wounds, to ballistics reports, to the gut-wrenching details of where their loved ones had fallen. Some sobbed openly. Others sat in stony silence, holding hands, staring straight ahead. Derek Palmer, Brooklyn's former manager, testified on the third day. His voice trembled as he described her as quiet, competent, but deeply withdrawn. He confessed to feeling guilt, said he had once joked that she could run the whole floor blindfolded, and now regretted every word. The court heard stories from parents who had lost children, from spouses whose lives had been shattered, from co-workers who had managed to crawl to safety through smoke and blood. Brooklyn remained impassive through it all. Dressed in state-issued gray, her hands chained at the waist, she watched the proceedings with the same detached calm that had defined her interrogation. She never spoke. She never looked toward the victims' families. At times, she scribbled in a notebook. At others, she simply stared ahead, her expression unreadable. No outbursts, no tears. The court appointed another psychiatric examiner mid-trial, just to confirm her The examiner returned with the same conclusion, deeply disturbed but legally sound. On the 21st day, closing arguments were delivered to a courtroom stretched to its emotional limits. The prosecution called her a soul consumed by hatred. The defense called her a tragedy within a tragedy. The jury deliberated for less than 8 hours. When they returned with their verdict, the room stood still. Guilty on all 42 counts of first-degree murder. Guilty on multiple counts of attempted murder. Guilty on the possession and use of illegal explosives. There was no recommendation for the death penalty. Instead, the judge, his voice hoarse from weeks of presiding, sentenced Brooklyn Myers to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision brought neither joy nor closure, only a somber finality. Brooklyn was transferred to Lowell Correctional Institution, one of the most secure facilities in Florida. She was placed in solitary confinement both for her safety and the safety of others. Her cell, monitored constantly, contains little more than a concrete bed, a steel sink, and a narrow slit of a window that shows only sky. She does not interact with other inmates. She receives limited mail. The journal she kept during trial was confiscated after guards found drawings of burning buildings and pages marked with more X's. She is allowed an hour of isolated exercise per day. She takes no visitors. Outside prison walls, her case left deep and lasting scars. Within months of her sentencing, a wave of legislative proposals swept through state legislatures. Florida passed a set of reforms expanding background checks for firearm purchases, mandating a 30-day waiting period for buyers under 25, and allocating new funding toward mental health outreach programs in schools and workplaces. A federal task force was established to research early signs of violence in isolated youth. Nationwide, companies began re-examining their internal threat protocols. The massacre had revealed terrifying blind spots, and now everyone was scrambling to fill them. But for the families of the 42 who were lost, reform was no substitute for the lives they could never reclaim. Grief took root and stayed. Empty chairs at dinner tables, children growing up without parents, parents growing old without children. Some families moved away from Fort Lauderdale, unable to bear the weight of the memories. Others stayed, committed to honoring the victims through foundations, scholarships, and advocacy. The rebuilt Coastal Dynamics building now carries a different name. At its front entrance stands a bronze plaque, mounted into the stone walkway, engraved with the names of each victim. Fresh flowers appear there weekly, and every May 5th, at exactly 8:16 a.m. ing, the minute the shooting began, the city pauses. Streets fall silent. Schools observe a moment of reflection. Bells toll 42 times across church towers. In those moments, Brooklyn's name is never mentioned. Only the names of the fallen echo through the city that remembers. A silence that began in a cubicle, once unnoticed and unthreatening, had transformed into something no one could ever forget. And now, every year it returns, an absence marked in time, a memory branded into the fabric of a place, a scream that never fades.